Destiny Moore never imagined that the man she had spent 5 years building an empire for would one day look her in the eyes and tell her she was nothing more than a stepping stone. That rain-slicked midnight in their modern Seoul apartment, Jae-Sung Lee walked through the door not with a tired smile, but with a cold-eyed mistress named Yuna on his arm. With a sharp jawline set in stone, he calmly ordered Destiny to pack her bags and leave, even threatening to have her arrested for trespassing in the home she had helped pay for. Broken and in a state of sheer disbelief, Destiny stumbled out into the freezing downpour. She stood on the wet pavement, tears streaming down her face, when she was suddenly blinded by the high-beam headlights of a sleek luxury car, and the shadow of a man with dark ink on his neck stepped forward to claim her. Destiny stood paralyzed, the heat from the luxury car's engine radiating against the freezing rain. The man didn't say a word, but his silent presence felt like a fortress rising up around her. As his hand remained firm on her shoulder, providing the first bit of warmth she had felt in years, the world seemed to slow down. She looked back at the glowing windows of the apartment she once called home, seeing Jae-Sung's silhouette behind the glass, already turning away, already forgetting her. But as the mysterious man guided her toward the open door of the sedan, the shadow of her past began to pull back, revealing the path that had led her to this rain-slicked pavement. Destiny Moore hadn't always been a woman standing broken in the streets of Seoul. Long before the betrayal, she was a girl with a deep, warm complexion and a laugh that could light up the darkest corners of Atlanta, Georgia. Raised by a family that valued resilience above all else, Destiny was a brilliant student of international law who viewed the world as a place of endless possibility. When she first arrived in South Korea, she didn't come looking for a husband or a master. She came to build a life of purpose. She had arrived in Seoul with a heart full of dreams and a suitcase full of books, ready to conquer the city on her own terms. But fate had a different plan. It was in the quiet corners of a university library that she first encountered the sharp jawline and calculating charm of Jae-Sung Lee. At the time, she thought she had found a partner to build a future with. She never realized she was simply the foundation for an empire he intended to rule without her. Destiny thought she was losing everything that night in the rain, but she was actually being saved from a life of lies. If you believe that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Let's dive into Chapter 1 to see how Destiny's journey of love and labor turned into a high-stakes game of power and revenge. Destiny's mind drifted back to the sweltering heat of an Atlanta summer 5 years ago, a time when her life felt as expansive as the Georgia sky. She had been the star of her family, a young woman with a sharp legal mind and a deep, warm soul that saw the best in everyone. When she met Jae-Sung Lee, he was a brilliant but struggling international student, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his jawline, yet often dulled by the weight of his empty pockets. Destiny hadn't seen a stranger, she had seen a partner. She had seen a man who worked 3 jobs just to afford his textbooks, and her heart had ached for his struggle. Against the cautious advice of her parents, Richard and Diane, Destiny made a choice that would rewrite her entire future. She didn't just support Jae-Sung, she became his foundation. When his student visa faced complications, she navigated the legal labyrinth for him. When his tuition soared, she picked up extra shifts at a law firm, pouring her hard-earned savings into his dreams rather than her own. She believed in him with a ferocity that was both beautiful and dangerous. "You're going to change the world, Jae-Sung," she had whispered one evening as they sat in a cramped apartment, sharing a single bowl of ramen. He had taken her hand then, his light complexion contrasting with her deep, warm skin, and promised her that once he made it, she would never have to work a day in her life. He promised her the world. And Destiny, fueled by a love that knew no borders, agreed to move with him to Seoul after his graduation. Leaving Atlanta was the greatest sacrifice of her life. She left the comfort of her community and the security of her rising career to follow him to a land where she was a permanent outsider. In those early years in Seoul, the sacrifice only deepened. While Jae-Sung worked to launch his first tech venture, Destiny worked behind the scenes, editing his business proposals and using her knowledge of international law to ensure his contracts were airtight. She was the ghostwriter of his success, the silent engine driving his ascent. She lived frugally, wearing simple sweaters and modest coats so he could afford the tailored suits he needed to look the part for investors. She learned the language, navigated the complex social hierarchies of South Korea, and built a home for him that was a sanctuary from the cutthroat business world. Every time Jae-Sung closed a deal or reached a new milestone, Destiny celebrated as if the victory were her own. She never noticed that as his bank account grew, his heart seemed to shrink. She never noticed that the man who once shared a bowl of ramen with her was slowly being replaced by a man who saw people only as assets to be managed or discarded. She had given him her youth, her intellect, and her heart, believing that they were building a life together. She had sacrificed her own sunlight to make sure he could shine, never imagining that the very empire she helped him build would eventually become the fortress he would use to lock her out. As she sat in the back of the black sedan, the neon lights of Seoul blurred past the window, a bitter realization began to take hold. Her sacrifice hadn't been an investment in a marriage. It had been a gift to a man who never intended to pay her back. As Jae-Sung's tech venture transitioned from a fledgling startup into a dominant force in Seoul's skyline, the atmosphere in their home shifted from shared warmth to a sterile, high-altitude chill. Destiny began to notice that the man who once sought her counsel on every legal clause now barely looked up from his phone when she entered the room. The humility that had defined him in Atlanta had been replaced by a razor-sharp arrogance, a belief that his success was solely a product of his own genius, conveniently forgetting the years Destiny spent working double shifts to keep his dreams afloat. The glass ceiling wasn't just in his office, it was in their marriage. Jae-Sung began to treat Destiny like a relic of his lean years, a reminder of a struggle he wanted to bury. He stopped introducing her at corporate galas, and when he did, he spoke of her as a homemaker, effectively erasing her law degree and the countless nights she had spent refining his business strategies. He grew obsessed with status, trading their cozy shared memories for the hollow prestige of designer labels and the cold company of men who measured worth by net profit. The true shift, however, came with the arrival of Yuna. Destiny first saw her during an unannounced visit to the office to bring Jae-Sung a home-cooked meal, a small gesture to bridge the growing distance between them. Yuna was younger, polished to a high sheen, and moved through the office with an air of entitlement that suggested she owned more than just her job title. As Jae-Sung's new strategic assistant, she was everything Destiny had been told she wasn't needed for anymore. Destiny watched from the doorway as Yuna leaned over Jae-Sung's desk, her laughter light and practiced, while Jae-Sung looked at her with an intensity he hadn't shown Destiny in months. The meal in Destiny's hands felt suddenly heavy, a symbol of a devotion that had become obsolete. When Jae-Sung finally noticed her, there was no smile of gratitude, only a flicker of irritation. "You should have called first, Destiny," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "We're in the middle of a high-stakes merger. Yuna, and I don't have time for distractions." The word distraction cut deeper than any insult. Destiny looked at Yuna, who didn't bother to hide her condescending smirk, and then back at the man she had sacrificed her own career to elevate. She saw the way Yuna whispered in his ear, feeding his ego with the flattery he now craved. It wasn't just that another woman was in his office, it was that Jae-Sung was allowing her to replace the intellectual and emotional space Destiny had occupied for half a decade. For the first time, Destiny felt the cold realization that she was being phased out of the empire she had helped build. The glass ceiling wasn't just preventing her from rising, it was being lowered to crush her. As she left the office that day, the luxury marble floors felt like ice under her feet. She began to see the patterns, the late nights, the secret phone calls, and the way Jae-Sung now spoke of their future as his future. The man she loved was disappearing, replaced by a stranger who saw her loyalty as a debt he no longer wished to pay. The tension that had been simmering for months finally reached its boiling point on a night when the sky over Seoul seemed to weep with a relentless, icy rain. Destiny was in the kitchen, the warmth of a nearly finished dinner filling the air, when the heavy front door of the apartment swung open. She turned, a hopeful smile dying on her lips as Jae-Sung walked in, his expensive coat glistening with raindrops. He wasn't alone. Yuna stood beside him, her arm possessively looped through his, her eyes scanning the room with a predatory sense of ownership. The air in the room turned brittle. Destiny's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Jae-sung? What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at her with the eyes of the man who had promised her forever in Atlanta. He looked at her like she was a line item on a ledger that needed to be erased. "It's over, Destiny," he said, his tone flat and clinical. "I've filed the papers. Yuna is moving in tonight." "Tonight? Jae-sung, I have nowhere to go. I've given everything to this life to you." Destiny's voice broke, the sheer weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. Jae-sung let out a short, mocking laugh that felt like a blade. "You gave me what I needed to get here. You were a stepping stone, Destiny. But a man in my position needs a partner who fits the image, not a reminder of where I started." He stepped toward her, his shadow looming large against the minimalist decor she had carefully chosen. "I'm calling the police in 5 minutes. If you aren't gone by then, I'll have you removed for trespassing. Don't make this more pathetic than it already is." Minutes later, Destiny found herself on the wet pavement of the sidewalk, a single suitcase at her feet and the sound of the apartment's electronic lock clicking shut behind her. The cold rain soaked through her modest coat in seconds, mixing with the hot tears that blurred her vision. She stood in the darkness of the midnight exile, a woman who had built a kingdom only to be cast into the moat. Just as the despair threatened to swallow her whole, the street illuminated. The blinding high beams of a black luxury sedan cut through the downpour, the engine purring with a low, dangerous rumble. The car drifted to a stop directly in front of her, and the back door swung open. A man stepped out, his presence commanding and silent. Under the glow of the streetlights, Destiny saw the sharp jawline, the tailored black suit, and the dark ink of a dragon's tail curling up his neck. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply placed a heavy, grounding hand on her shoulder, a gesture that felt less like an invitation and more like an acquisition. "He is a fool who doesn't know the value of the gold he throws away," the man said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in her soul. He guided her into the plush, leather interior of the sedan, the scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood replacing the smell of rain and wet asphalt. As the car pulled away, leaving the glowing tower of Jae-sung's apartment behind, Destiny looked at the man beside her. His intense eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his hand resting calmly on his knee. She didn't know where they were going, but as the heater began to take the chill from her bones, she realized that for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't the one doing the protecting. She was the one being protected. Destiny woke to the soft chime of a grandfather clock, the sound resonating through a room that felt larger than her entire former apartment. The air was warm and scented with expensive sandalwood and aged parchment. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing against silk sheets that felt like cool water against her skin. The harsh, neon-lit rain of the previous night felt like a fever dream, yet the dull ache in her chest remained a steady reminder of the life she had lost. She climbed out of the massive bed, her bare feet sinking into a plush Persian rug. Near the window, her damp clothes from the night before had been replaced by a neutral-colored cashmere sweater and a dark, elegant coat that rested over a chair. Moving to the window, she drew back the heavy velvet curtains and gasped. She wasn't in the cramped, busy streets of Gangnam anymore. She was in a sprawling estate hidden behind high stone walls on the outskirts of the city, a fortress of old wealth and quiet power. A soft knock at the door preceded the entry of an older woman in a sharp uniform, who bowed deeply. "The master is waiting for you in the study, Miss Moore. Please follow me." Destiny's heart raced as she was led through corridors lined with priceless art and polished mahogany. When she reached the study, the man from the rain was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over a manicured garden. He had discarded his suit jacket, revealing a black dress shirt that hugged his powerful frame. The tattoos on his neck and hands seemed to glow in the morning light, marking him as a man who lived outside the boundaries of ordinary society. "Eat," he said without turning, gesturing to a table spread with a lavish breakfast. "Who are you?" Destiny asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And why did you help me?" The man turned slowly, his narrow, intense eyes locking onto hers with an authority that made the air feel heavy. "My name is Mitchell Kong," he replied, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "And I didn't just happen to find you last night, Destiny." He walked toward the desk, picking up a folder and tossing it onto the table. Destiny looked down and saw a photo of herself from 3 years ago, leaving a government building after filing a complex international patent for Jae-Sung. "I've been watching the rise of Lee Tech for a long time," Kong continued, his expression unreadable. "I watched as Jae-Sung Lee built a kingdom on the back of your intellect. I watched him take credit for your legal strategies and your late-night brilliance. But most importantly, I watched him become a man who forgot that loyalty is the only currency that matters in this city." He stepped closer, his presence looming, but strangely protective. "I have no use for men like Jae-Sung. But a woman who can build an empire for a fool while remaining invisible? That is a woman I have a great deal of use for." Destiny stared at him, the realization sinking in. She hadn't been rescued by a random stranger. She had been recruited by a lion who had seen her worth long before she ever saw his face. "You want me to work for you," she whispered. "I want you to take back what you built," Kong corrected, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I provide the power. You provide the mind. And together, we will show Jae-Sung Lee exactly what happens when the foundation he discarded decides to bring the whole house down." The days that followed were a blur of intense intellectual labor and physical transformation. Mitchell Kong did not treat Destiny as a guest or a victim. He treated her as a dormant weapon that needed sharpening. Under the gilded ceilings of the mansion, the rebranding of Destiny Moore began. It started with a complete overhaul of her presence. Kong's personal tailors arrived, replacing her modest, tear-stained sweaters with structured blazers, silk blouses, and tailored trousers that commanded respect before she even spoke a word. He wanted her to look like the authority she had always been, but had been too humble to claim. "Your kindness was your shield in Atlanta, Destiny," Kong told her one evening, his voice low as they sat across from each other in the massive library, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. "But in Seoul, a shield is not enough. You need a sword." The sword he spoke of was her brilliant legal mind. Kong began presenting her with his legal portfolio's vast, complex networks of international shipping, real estate, and tech investments that spanned continents. While the world saw Kong as a figure of the shadows, Destiny realized his empire was built on a foundation of intricate legal maneuvers that were as brilliant as they were ruthless. She spent 18 hours a day dissecting contracts, identifying loopholes, and restructuring his offshore holdings with a precision that even Kong's veteran lawyers couldn't match. For the first time in years, Destiny wasn't working to make someone else look good. She was working to make herself indispensable. Kong taught her how to navigate the high-stakes boardrooms of South Korea, where a woman, especially a foreign woman, was often underestimated. He taught her the mafia way of negotiation, to speak less, observe more, and always hold the most dangerous card until the final second. Don't just find the error in their contracts, Kong coached, his dark, narrow eyes reflecting the glow of the desk lamp. Find the fear behind the error. Use the law to trap them before they even know a cage is being built. As she took over the management of his most prestigious portfolios, Destiny felt a new version of herself emerging. The vulnerability that had defined her on that rain-slicked night was being forged into a cold, focused determination. She learned to mask her emotions behind a veil of professional poise, her deep brown eyes no longer glossy with tears, but sharp with calculation. One afternoon, while finalizing a cross-border merger that would secure Kong's dominance in the tech sector, the very sector Jae-Sung was trying to monopolize, Destiny caught her reflection in the polished mahogany of the desk. She looked at the woman in the sharp black suit, the woman whose signature now carried the weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire. She realized that Kong hadn't just given her a job, he had given her back her agency. She was no longer a stepping stone. She was becoming the architect of a new destiny, one where she held the power to decide who stayed in the room and who was cast out into the cold. The transformation was nearly complete, and as she closed the final folder, she knew it was time to move from the shadows of the mansion to the light of the city. Jae-Sung Lee had no idea that the woman he discarded was about to become the most dangerous legal mind in Seoul. The digital landscape of Seoul was a battlefield, and Destiny Moore was its most invisible soldier. Seated in Mitchell Kong's high-tech command center, the glow of multiple monitors reflected in her steady, dark eyes. She didn't feel like the woman who had wept on a sidewalk a few weeks ago. She felt like a surgeon about to perform a necessary, albeit painful, extraction. Jae-Sung had forgotten that while he wore the crown of Lee Tech, Destiny had been the one who wrote the code for the palace gates. She began her first strike not with a loud explosion, but with a whisper. Using encrypted access keys she had designed years ago, keys Jae-Sung was too arrogant to realize still existed, she slipped into the back-end servers of his primary development project. She didn't delete files or crash systems. That would be too obvious. Instead, she initiated a quiet sabotage. She introduced a series of microscopic, logic-based errors into the international patent filings he was preparing. These were errors that only a seasoned international law expert would catch, and they were designed to ensure that when his billion-dollar merger finally hit the global stage, his intellectual property would be legally indefensible. Precision is better than passion, Destiny. Mitchell Kong's voice drifted from the shadows behind her. He stood leaning against the doorframe, watching her work with a look of quiet approval. Passion burns out. Precision cuts deep. Destiny didn't look up, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. He thinks he's untouchable because he's moving funds through offshore shell companies. He's using the same structures I set up for him in our second year of marriage. A cold, ghost of a smile touched her lips. He never bothered to learn how they actually work. With a final keystroke, She rerouted a series of high-interest loan repayments from his personal accounts to a dormant charity fund she had established years ago in Atlanta. It was a small amount, enough to be annoying, but not enough to trigger an immediate fraud alarm. It was the first leak in a dam she intended to break. She also leaked a single, anonymous tip to a financial journalist regarding irregularities in Lee Tech's recent Series B funding. It was a breadcrumb that would lead directly to the consulting fees Jae-Sung had been paying to Yuna's private accounts, money that actually belonged to his shareholders. As the sun began to rise over the Han River, casting a pale light into the room, Destiny leaned back in her chair. The digital seeds of Jae-Sung's destruction had been sown. He would wake up to a world that felt slightly tilted, a series of unfortunate technical glitches and minor legal inquiries that would slowly bleed his confidence and his capital. She watched a live feed of the Lee Tech headquarters on one of the screens. Somewhere in that glass tower, Jae-Sung was likely celebrating his upcoming merger with Yuna, oblivious to the fact that the woman he called a stepping stone had just turned the ground beneath him into quicksand. Destiny felt a calm, chilling sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about money or business, it was about reclaiming the intellectual soul he had stolen from her. The first strike was over, and the shadow of the Mafia Boss was growing longer over the empire Jae-Sung Lee thought he owned. The game had truly begun. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive cologne, and the hushed murmurs of Seoul's elite. It was an environment designed to intimidate, but as Destiny more stepped through the gilded doors, she felt nothing but a cold, crystalline focus. She was no longer the invisible woman standing in the shadows of Jae-Sung's ambition. Dressed in a floor-length, structured gown of midnight velvet that complemented her deep, warm complexion, she looked like a queen reclaiming her throne. Beside her, Mitchell Kong moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a predator, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The tattoos on his neck were partially hidden by a crisp white collar, but his aura of absolute authority was unmistakable. Across the room, Jae-Sung Lee was at the height of his performative glory. He was holding a glass of champagne, laughing at a joke made by a high-ranking minister, with Yuna draped over his arm like a glittering accessory. He looked every bit the successful tech mogul, but Destiny could see the subtle signs of the quiet sabotage she had initiated. There was a frantic edge to his eyes, a slight tremor in his hand that suggested the recent glitches in his merger were starting to take their toll. The moment their eyes met, the air seemed to leave the room. Jae-Sung's laughter died instantly. He froze, his glass hovering midair as he stared at the woman he had thrown out into the rain just weeks before. But this wasn't the broken, tearful Destiny he remembered. This was a woman whose presence commanded the attention of every dignitary in the hall. When he saw who she was standing with, when he recognized the unmistakable profile of Mitchell Kong, the blood drained from his face until his light skin was as pale as ash. "Destiny," he stammered as they approached, his voice cracking. Yuna's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, defensive jealousy as she realized the woman she had helped evict was now the most captivating person in the ballroom. Destiny didn't stop. She didn't offer a greeting or a look of longing. She simply walked past him, her gaze cool and indifferent, as if he were a ghost from a life she had long since outgrown. Mitchell Kong, however, paused. He leaned in toward Jae-Sung, his narrow eyes flashing with a dangerous amusement. "You have a habit of discarding things of immense value, Mr. Lee," Kong whispered, his voice a low vibration that only Jae-Sung could hear. "In my world, that is considered a fatal error in judgment. I should thank you, though. It's rare to find a foundation so well built left lying in the street." Jae-Sung watched them walk away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the powerful man who now protected his ex-wife, and then at Destiny's elegant, receding figure. For the first time, the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He had thought he was trading up, but looking at Yuna's suddenly shallow beauty and his own crumbling empire, he realized he had thrown away the only person who truly knew how to keep him standing. The Gala of Ghosts had become a haunting. He was surrounded by the elite, yet he had never felt more isolated or more hunted. The game had shifted, and as he watched Destiny move with effortless grace among the city's most powerful figures, he knew he wasn't just losing his business, he was losing his life. The collapse of Jae-Sung Lee's empire did not happen with a bang, but with a cold, rhythmic clicking of computer keys inside Mitchell Kong's estate. For years, Jae-Sung had treated the company coffers like a personal treasury, moving funds to satisfy Yuna's expensive tastes and to maintain the facade of a man who didn't need the wife he had discarded. He believed his tracks were covered by layers of complex offshore accounts, but he had forgotten that Destiny Moore was the one who had mapped the maze. With Mitchell Kong's vast resources and high-level connections in the financial sector, the quiet sabotage Destiny began weeks ago reached its devastating conclusion. She didn't just find the evidence of his embezzlement, she choreographed its reveal to the authorities and his board of directors simultaneously. One morning, Jae-Sung walked into his office to find not a celebratory coffee, but a team of forensic auditors and federal investigators waiting for him. The documents Destiny provided were irrefutable, tracing every stolen one back to the secret accounts he had used to fund his new life. As the news of the scandal broke across the financial wires, the house of cards began to fold. Jae-Sung's first instinct was to reach for the woman he had traded his soul for. He burst into their shared apartment, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. "Yuna, pack your things. We have to leave before the freeze hits my personal accounts," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. But Yuna was already standing by the door, 3 designer suitcases at her feet. She wasn't trembling, she was checking her reflection in the hall mirror. The warmth he thought he had found in her was gone, replaced by the same mercenary coldness Jae-Sung himself had once used against Destiny. Yuna asked, her voice light and devoid of emotion. "There is no we, Jae-Sung. My lawyer already reviewed the situation. You're a liability now. Yuna, I did all of this for you. I gave you everything," Jae-Sung pleaded, reaching for her hand. She stepped back as if his touch were a contagion. "You gave me what was convenient for you at the time. Now it's inconvenient." She looked at him with a clinical indifference that chilled him to the bone. "Don't bother calling. I've already had my number changed." As she walked out of the apartment, the silence that followed was deafening. Moments later, a notification chimed on his phone, a final, automated alert from his bank. His personal accounts, his credit lines, and the very lease on the apartment he stood in had been frozen by court order. The wealth that had been his shield and his pride vanished in a digital heartbeat. Jae-Sung sank to the floor of the empty, echoing hallway, the realization finally hitting him like a physical weight. He had betrayed the only person who would have stayed by his side through a storm for a woman who wouldn't even stay for a drizzle. He was a man with a title but no company, a house but no home, and a legacy that was now nothing more than a criminal case file. In the shadows of his own ruin, he finally understood the true cost of his stepping stone. Destiny Moore hadn't just left his life, she had taken the foundation of it with her, and without it, there was nothing left but the fall. The golden light of a new dawn began to creep over the jagged horizon of the Seoul skyline, burning away the morning mist that clung to the Han River. Destiny Moore stood on the expansive marble balcony of Mitchell Kong's penthouse, a cup of dark coffee warming her palms. The air was crisp and clean, a far cry from the suffocating, rain-drenched night that had brought her to this threshold. She wore a robe of heavy cream silk, her deep, warm complexion glowing in the first rays of the sun. For the first time in 5 years, the weight in her chest wasn't a burden, it was an anchor of peace. In the valley of glass and steel below, the city was waking up to a world where Lee Tech was a cautionary tale and Jae-Sung Lee was a ghost. She had heard the final reports late last night. Jae-Sung, stripped of his titles and his vanity, had been moved to a detention center to await trial, his name dragged through the very dirt he thought he had climbed out of. He was alone in a cold cell, haunted by the silence of a mistress who never loved him and the memory of a wife he had fundamentally underestimated. A quiet footfall sounded behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Mitchell Kong. His presence was a constant, now a silent, immovable force that had provided the ground for her to stand on while she rebuilt her soul. He stepped up beside her, leaning his powerful frame against the railing. The tattoos on his hand were visible as he reached out, not to claim her, but to acknowledge her. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the world they now shared, loyalty was understood, and power was a language spoken in the quiet moments of triumph. "It's a beautiful morning, Destiny," he said, his gravelly baritone vibrating in the still air. "It's a different morning," she replied, her voice steady and rich with a newfound authority. "I used to look at this city and see a place where I had to prove I belonged. Now I see a place that belongs to me." Destiny looked out at the sprawling metropolis, thinking of the girl from Atlanta who had arrived with nothing but a legal degree and a heart full of misplaced devotion. That girl was gone, forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the wisdom of the shadows. She had reclaimed her intellect, her dignity, and her future. She was no longer anyone's stepping stone. She was the architect of her own reign. As the sun fully emerged, bathing the city in a brilliant, unforgiving light, Destiny felt a profound sense of closure. She didn't hate Jae-Sung anymore. Hate required an emotional investment she was no longer willing to make. He was simply a lesson learned. She turned back toward the warmth of the penthouse, the doors held open by a man who respected her brilliance as much as he guarded her safety. The woman the city once ignored was now the woman the city admired from a distance, and as she stepped inside, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never look back. Destiny Moore was finally, irrevocably free.